learned what the Great Commission was, who it was given to, who the apostles were, what they were instructed to teach. Well, today we're going to delve into where the apostles traveled to spread God's word. First thing we need to realize that travel in those days was difficult at best. The only means of travel were to walk, ride an animal, or take a boat. Travel was slow and at times very dangerous, and that the roads that they traveled were really nothing more than paths beaten down into the wilderness. We also need to realize that when Jesus had his ministry, it was pretty much confined to what we consider today to be the Holy Lands. So that when you see how far some of the apostles were sent to travel, you'll be amazed. Here is where each of the apostles evangelized. And this is not a complete list because that would take most of the day. But it's the main high points of where each apostle was sent. Andrew traveled to Scythia, Greece, and Asia Minor. Bartholomew to Phrygia, Hierapolis, Armenia, and India. James the Elder was only traveled into Jerusalem and Judea before he was martyred by Herod. James the Younger was in Palestine and Egypt. John had taken most of his ministry and kept it in the Asia Minor region. Jude went to Assyria, Persia, Edessa. Peter to Babylon and Rome. Philip to Samaria, Caesarea, Philippi, and Hierapolis. Matthew to Ethiopia. Thomas to Madras in India. Simon the Zealot had no record anywhere that I could find of where he traveled to. Then we get into some of the main characters, which was Paul, and he was the most traveled of all of the disciples. He went to Syria, Jerusalem, Antioch, Cyprus, Malta, Sardinia, Greece, Turkey, Rome, and there's even reports in some history books that he possibly even went as far west as to go into England. Barnabas, he traveled with Paul, so just about anywhere Paul went, Barnabas went. Lazarus traveled to Cyprus and France, and he has been credited with establishing the church in France. Mark was in Cyprus, Egypt, and Rome. Luke was in Philippi, Peloponnese, and Matthias, who replaced Judas, is been documented to have been in Armenia. As you consider the travels the disciples made, you must wonder how they ever found some of the places that they went to, since they did not have very many navigational instruments like we have today. It can only be concluded that God sent them where He wanted them to be, where He wanted them to spread the message of God's love. God does the same with us each and every day, whether we travel down the street to the supermarket, we travel throughout the state, perhaps even the country or the world. God calls us all to share God's word and God's love with everyone that we meet. So even if you never leave Pennsylvania or just York County, you can still be a powerful witness to God. Amen. Because we have many opportunities each and every day to witness to people. The main thrust of this lesson is to get people to realize that in the days of old, when the apostles and the disciples had been sent out, it was not an easy task like it is today. You want to go to Rome, you jump on an airplane and you're there in 7 or 8 hours. Most of the disciples, though their travels were many hundred miles, faced great hardships and great danger wherever they went. The hardships, most of that area had not really been settled. There were small cities and villages and stuff like that, but the main portion of the area back in Jesus' time had really not been populated. So it would be very easy, as it was stated before, to go down and start to go to a city and get lost and end up wandering out in the desert. The dangers not only came from nature and the problems that nature could throw at, but at that point in time, the disciples and the martyrs were being martyred because of their belief in Jesus. Yet it did not stop them. They continued to press forward. Yet we today think it's a very big deal if we've got to travel 20 or 30 miles. Or, I don't really want to go to church today. It's raining, or it's cold, or it's snowing, or it's too hot, or whatever excuses we use. Imagine where we would be with our faith today had not the apostles and the disciples pressed forward in spite of all of the disadvantages they had and all of the adversity that they faced, if they used every excuse in the book like the modern Christian or so-called Christian. The majority of the travels of the disciple were in the northeast corner of Africa, Asia Minor, Persia, and the eastern part of the northern Mediterranean. When I was in the service, I had the opportunity to visit many of the places where the disciples walked. Unfortunately, at that point in time in my life, I had no idea that I was treading where history had been made. I can think back to the different tours and stuff that we took, and they would say, oh, this is the church and it was founded by, and they would describe who it was. But at that point in time, it didn't sink in. When you're 19 or 20 years old, the places that the disciples and the men of God from days of old had walked were really not important to us. The same thing when we got up to Rome. You know, the Roman history was just fantastic. It was unbelievable. But we weren't so much interested in the churches and the religious historical spots. We wanted to see the Colosseum where the lions ate the Christians and stuff like that. It makes you wonder how much we have all missed in our lives growing up by not being aware of what it is that we really should be learning. When you view some of the places that were visited and evangelized by the apostles, it is hard to recognize today that Christianity ever really had a strong foothold in some of those places. It just goes to show you that though thousands of years have passed, we as Christians have not made a great deal of an impression upon the peoples in some of these areas. In some of them, Christianity has blossomed, but in other places, it's persecuted. I can remember when we were in Turkey, and we were told straightforward by people from the State Department, you're allowed to go here, here, and here. If you go anywhere else, you're actually taking your life in your hands. And that was as early or late, depending on how you want to look at it, as the late 1960s. In other places where you went, being a Christian, you were a novelty. People wanted to know what you believed. And when you were young and didn't realize the impact that you could have had on some of those people, you probably did not ever say the right thing. Yet, as I stop and think about the times that I was over in these areas, it made me really wonder. It would take us days and days to go from one place to another on a modern ship. And you think about these small wooden boats that they used to travel from point A to point B. It is no wonder that Paul was shipwrecked and they were fortunate to be able to get into the island of Malta. And if anybody out there has ever been to Malta, it's just basically a big piece of rock sitting in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. Not very big, but most of Malta has sheer cliffs down on the side, so it's even difficult to get from the city down to the waterfront. I can certainly imagine that it was certainly not any easier back in the early days when they didn't have steps cut down in there and some of the more modern conveniences that we have today. Yet, through all of the trials and tribulations that the apostles faced while they were basically exploring these new lands. We have to think about what they knew back in those days. Back when the apostles were out walking the earth, they still thought the earth was flat. Yet they ventured out, even though they must have known, especially with Paul and some of the other more adventuresome apostles, that there was a possibility that they could sail off the edge of the earth and never be heard from again. Yet it did not dissuade them. In fact, in some cases, it even encouraged them because they wanted to go farther and do more for the Lord than anybody had ever done before. Some of the apostles traveled a great deal, while others stayed in a relatively confined area for their entire lives. The sad thing about the apostles was, with two exceptions, and then when I'm talking about the apostles, I'm also talking about the disciples that came after them. Only two of them ever died from natural causes. Most of them met violent, cruel deaths because they would not bow down to what Rome wanted them to believe. We look today at the missionaries that are all over the world, and there are thousands and thousands of them. I was curious when I was doing this, and I started scanning through some of the information about missionaries. And if my memory serves me correctly, just the Southern Baptists alone have over 30,000 missionaries stationed around the world. The Catholic Church had a huge number of missionaries at one point in time, but their numbers have been dropping off. All the rest of the major denominations all have programs to put missionaries in different parts of the world. Some of them are located in, quote, friendly countries that are not or have not been populated by a great number of Christians. Other ones have been sent to countries where their lives are in danger every minute of every day. The Middle East, parts of Africa, have rebelled strongly against the missionaries. Some of it is because they don't want to hear anything but whatever their pagan religion is teaching. Others are because the missionaries are trying to change their way of life, which causes a great deal of rebellion among the political leaders in the countries. That's much the same as what happened with the apostles and the disciples. The governments did not want them preaching the good news of Jesus Christ. They wanted them to just shut up and go away. They were rocking the apple cart. This is especially true in the countries where the Pharisees had made up their mind that Jesus had become, and the spread of Christianity had become a threat, not only to their government, but through all of the teachings that they had spewed forth amongst the people. It caused the people to want to get out of slavery, and that's basically what a lot of the people were in the Middle East. You know, they were slaves to the Pharisees and to the rulers of the time. They used them to build temples, they used them to build pyramids, they used them to build all sorts of things, even facilities that were used for ungodly purposes. And if they didn't fulfill their quotas, putting so many bricks together or getting so many stones put together that day, they just killed them. So when the workers were offered the opportunity to become free through Jesus, this was definitely a major threat to the way of life for what we consider today the rich and famous. It has been well written and well documented the number of times that Paul had been nearly killed, thrown in prison, beaten. And that was just one man. And even though he had many things that came against him in his travels, and they started right in Jerusalem and Syria area and went all the way through most of what at that point in time was the known world. And instead of being defeated or being discouraged, it only encouraged Paul more. We see things differently today. How many times have you gone up to somebody out there and said, "Can I pray for you? The Lord's telling me to pray for you." "No, go away. I don't want prayer."
Right.
And sadly enough, a lot of us will walk away. It's gotten to the point anymore where most of the time when I'm approaching somebody, I don't even ask them anymore. I just come up and say, "Hey, the Lord told me to pray for you." And you either catch them completely off guard, and then they don't know what to say, or else they'll say, "Sure, I can always use prayer." I think of the many times that I have had the opportunity, sadly to say, to witness to somebody, and I missed it. We all do that. We all miss opportunities to reach people. Some of them, I know in my heart, are because God stopped us from going out to reach them for whatever reason. Others was, this is a public place. What are people going to think? What if I do if they say no? So we let the enemy discourage us from doing what God wants us to because it's not comfortable for us. Imagine how uncomfortable it was for the apostles and the disciples when they saw their numbers being crucified and dying horrible deaths because they had the courage and God's blessing to go out and spread His word. A few weeks ago, was in a doctor's waiting room and saw the room filled with people. Had the opportunity to pray for two of them. But that night after I got home and was laying in bed, the Lord kept saying, well, there was 5 or 6 more of them in there. How come you didn't pray for them? If you're looking to witness to people, doctors' waiting rooms are prime areas because every one of them is there for reasons other than good health. And most of them are very open to have somebody pray for them. The other thing that amazes me are some of the people that you meet that just absolutely refuse to have you pray for them. There was a gentleman a few weeks ago where he was in a wheelchair, and it was not a motorized wheelchair, and he was having a terrible time getting to where he was going. So I asked him, I said, can I help you? And he said, no, I'm good. So I chalked that off to him wanting to be independent. And then I said to him, sir, the Lord told me to pray for you. Get away from me. I don't need prayer. And it showed me right then and there that it wasn't independence. It was pride that stopped him from getting prayed for and possibly healed. I'm convinced that we are coming into a time where we are going to be able to speak forth healings. We're going to be able to speak forth answers for prayers, because God has told us that we are going to do far greater things than even He did. Now, when my God sits down or writes this down and puts this in the good book and tells me I'm going to be able to do all these things, I don't understand why it took me so long to get to the point where I wanted to do these things. We use many excuses that we, unlike the apostles, find excuses for not doing God's work and not being in step with Him. But most of it boils down to the fact we're not comfortable doing it. We're afraid of what somebody's going to say, or we're afraid of what somebody's going to think. And you know, we need to get over that. The only person I really care who thinks what of me is God. Because you know what? He's the one that I have to answer to. I don't have to answer to the clerk in the store or the waitress in the restaurant or whoever for doing what God's told me to do. I remember the one time when I was working up at Sears, and there was a couple came into the store, and the woman had had a stroke, and she was having a great deal of difficulty, not only walking, but with her rehabilitation. And the Lord told me to go over and pray for them. So she couldn't get around, so we walked over. They were over in the fitness equipment because they were looking for an exercise bike that she could use to try and strengthen herself. And we started to pray for them right then and there in the store. And after we got done praying, and they were, both of them, both the wife and the husband were very thankful that somebody took the time to pray for them. And I'm not taking credit for that, because I will be the first one to tell you, I at first felt awkward praying for somebody in the middle of a department store. But after I did it, I realized at that point in time that I was just being obedient to God. So a little while later, one of the salespeople from another floor said, "I saw what you did over there. Aren't you afraid you're going to get fired for it?" And at that point in time, I said, "You know what?" I said, "I just did what God told me to do." I said, "If Sears wants to fire me, fine. I don't have a problem with that. Because if I can't pray for somebody, I don't want to work here." And it was not long after that that it seemed like almost every day that we worked, somebody came up that needed prayer or needed a word of encouragement. God tells us, if you have a gift, use it. He'll give you more of it, and more of it, and more of it. Yet we still seem like we want to hoard God's word for us. I think often about the sacrifices that the apostles and the disciples made back in those days. They left the world that they knew. Most of them were fishermen. Some of them were doctors. Some of them were tax collectors. But the majority of them were fishermen. They left the only world that they ever knew to follow Jesus. Yet for us, sometimes it's tough to just leave our seat to follow him. As you read more into the biographies of the apostles, you'll find out very few of them were considered learned men. They had very little education. They were what is known today as blue-collar workers. Yet God gave them the words to speak. God gave them the ability to share his word and to share it effectively with the people that they met. When we read about where the places that the apostles went to, by today's standards, it's just a little tiny area. But back in those days, I can't even begin to imagine how perilous the trip must have been from Jerusalem to go all the way up to Rome. It would probably take almost a lifetime to go that far by walking or by horseback back in those days. When you look on the maps and you see the paths that they took, almost every one of them traveled at least a portion of the way by boat. Yet, we know that even though they had a destination, how much of an influence did they have getting from point A to point B? Like I said, it's not like today where you jump on a plane and you're there in 2 hours or 3 hours or whatever it is. These were long, hard, difficult journeys. And yet, they never lost faith, and they witnessed to everyone that they met on the way. I was watching one of the programs on TV the other day, and they were talking to a gentleman who had come back from one of the West African countries. And he had made mention about how poor the people were over there. But the one thing that he did say was how hungry they were for God. He said in the area that they were in, there was 4 missionaries covering about 1,000 square miles. He said we could use 400 people in that area and still not touch everybody. The villages are remote. You have to travel through jungle and desert and all kinds of things to get through these countries. But he said everywhere you went, once you got there, the people did not want you to leave. They just wanted to hear God. They said you could sit them down on a dirt floor in the middle of a hut and talk for a week, and they'd never tell you, hey, look at the time. They also said that these people literally had nothing. But whatever they did have, they would more than willingly share with the missionaries that were over there. Yet we read in the newspaper not too long ago about the group of missionaries from one of the denominations that was over in England. And England is one of the birthplaces of civilization. And yet 2 missionaries got killed over there for preaching the word. And when they brought the rest of them back to this country, they testified to the great deal of hardship and mistreatment that they had received from some of the people. I'm sure that there are a lot of these places that welcome missionaries, not so much because they want to hear God's word, but they want what the missionaries bring. In some places, it's electricity to villages that have never had electricity. In other places, it's doctors and medicine to people that don't have adequate medical care. Yet the Lord puts us there to plant that seed. I've often wondered at the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people that I've talked to in my life. I often wonder how many seeds that were planted ever grew. I often wonder what impact a conversation that maybe you or I had with somebody 10 or 15 years ago finally rang a bell and they've accepted the Lord. I wish there was a way, not to be boastful or anything, but just a way that we could ever find out how many people we planted that little seed from that finally took notice. There's a lot of people that you talk to, and some of them are very educated people. They're not dumb by any means, but how many people are willing to blow the Lord off as religious freak? Why do you even bother doing that? Why do you go to church? And I keep telling them the same thing. You're going to find out someday why. Because whether you want to believe it, someday you're going to come face to face with the Lord. And He's going to come back and tell you, hey, remember when Dave talked to you about the Lord and you told him to go away? So you're going to answer for that. Not because you blew me off, because you blew God off. It's encouraging that we see a great movement in the last couple of years within the youth, holding rallies and having these 3- and 4-day sessions in the hills where they praise and worship and listen to God. And I often wonder, how come you don't bring mom and dad with you? There have been times right here in this ministry where I have gotten up and spoke for a few minutes, and I've looked out and I have seen 20, 22 women and 4 or 5 men. Are you ladies that much holier than we are? Or are you more open to the Lord? Is it a guy thing that we're just stubborn, that we don't want anybody to take control of our lives? Because if that's so, I just want to tell you something, guys. You're missing out on a good deal, because the Lord never steers you straight, or never steers you wrong. He always steers you straight. When you got a problem, you don't have to go it alone. You give it to Him and let Him carry the burden for you. It was a lot of years ago that things happened in my life that were anything but godly, anything but pleasant. My life basically was spinning out of control. And having been a person who has been in control of their lives and control other people's lives to an extent for a lot of years, it was hard to fathom that I no longer had control over my life. And I can remember falling down on my hands and knees alongside the bed and saying, God, I can't do it anymore. I can't do it. I've lost control. I don't know what to do. I don't know what to say. I don't know where to go. I've made a mess of things. It's yours, God. It's yours completely, 100%. And you know what? That night, God took control. And he spoke to me and told me, you have to do this and this and this. You need to go to the people that you hurt. You need to apologize. You need to ask their forgiveness. And I'll tell you what, it was a hard thing to do. But the minute that I did it, the Lord lifted a weight off of my shoulders that was unlike anything I've ever experienced before. You don't realize the burdens that you carry until you give them over to the Lord and let Him take care of them. I'm sure that there is not one of us here or out in the TV land that has not gone down the same path at some point in their life. And a lot of times I believe things happen to us, and God allows things to happen to us. Not to punish us, but to make us more able to deal with situations in our life. I can remember a long, long time ago, I had a teacher in high school that I was very good friends with. And he often said that you cannot really teach something until you know it. You can have somebody read out of a book to you, but they don't know any more about what they're talking about than what you do. So God lets things happen in our lives to make us wiser, to make us more able to be able to go up to somebody and say, I know what you're going through because I've been there myself. I just wish that we could all learn these lessons without some of them being so painful. But when we talk about pain, the pain that we deal with is nothing like the pain that the apostles and the disciples suffered when they were evangelizing. Today, the roads are much smoother, they're much straighter, they're much more easily traveled. But they're no less fraught with pain and danger than they were back in the old days. Because there is an enemy out there that wants to kill, steal, and destroy everything that he can that's associated with God's kingdom. If you are ever under the impression that the minute that you accept the Lord, everything is just going to be rosy, nothing bad is ever going to happen to you, it's not true. If you are powerful, in God's Spirit, the devil is going to throw everything he can at you so that you will give up, that you will quit. It is, quote, too hard. But the more you press through and the more things that you go through, the greater the witness is that you have to share. Almost all of the references for this lesson today comes out of Acts. If you don't ever read another book of the Bible, read Acts, because that's going to show you the sacrifices that were made so that you can hear this message today. You're going to walk, quote, a mile in the apostles' sandals. You're going to find just exactly how God is going to use you to evangelize the world. We need to realize that we may be the only point of contact that some person is going to have between them and the Lord. You realize the awesome responsibility that is? Are you going to step up to the plate? Are you going to step up and say, hey, Lord, that's what I want. That's what I want to do. I'm willing to take that responsibility. I'm willing to go that extra mile to share you and your love with somebody that needs it. It's funny because sometimes just a simple word to somebody can make all the difference in the world in their lives. I can remember one day there was a little old lady, and I don't even remember where I was anymore, but God told me to go over and speak to her. And I walked over and I didn't have an idea what to say to her. I just walked over and I said, you know, I said, God told me to tell you that He loves you. And her face lit up like a Christmas tree. And she said, why did you do that? And I said, because the Lord told me to. And she says, well, if you're talking to the Lord, tell Him I love Him too. And I said, ma'am, that's your job. I said, tonight when you're sitting down, instead of watching TV, take 5 minutes and talk to the Lord and say, Lord, thank you for sending me that message today. It meant a lot to me. So we go forth anymore, we have to be willing to say, okay, whatever it is, whatever it takes, wherever I have to go, Lord, I commit myself to do that today. Because if we don't do it, who's going to? It's been spoken before, and it's been prophesied that it is the smaller, truth-based ministries that are going to lead the way into the next, excuse me, the next great revival. And it's coming. The signs are popping up all over that we are about ready to receive another new and greater outpouring of God than we have ever seen before. So let us not waste a second of this outpouring.